Byron Belitsos is the publisher, editor, and co-author of numerous acclaimed and award-winning books, including books about extraterrestrial contact and many related to the Urantia Book. His latest book is Reason and Revelation, scholarly essays about the Urantia Book, published in May of 2024. Who will be talking about extraterrestrial contact experiences of Phillip Krapf, a former Los Angeles Times reporter, and the Urantia Book.
You are listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, I want to welcome you, Byron, to Exopolitics Today. Great to have you here.
Great to be here. Good to see you again.
Well, why don't we begin with your background? Because you have a very interesting background. I know you have some academic degrees, and you have two master's degrees. So why don't you tell us about your kind of background and how you got interested in this whole UFO extraterrestrial phenomenon?
Well, I started out as kind of a generalist, and as a student at Chicago, University of Chicago, I was interested mainly in history of civilization, the history of Western civilization, in particular history of philosophy, and also social theory, and that sort of thing, back in the early 70s. I was stimulated into sort of by happenstance into an interest in esoteric fields, just as a hobby on the side. Began to really read widely, kind of in the summers. And one summer when I was a student, I happened to be up at 3 a.m. in the morning when there was somebody came on a radio show and started talking about the Urantia Book, which was such an odd thing. And in fact, it was exactly 50 years ago this month. And I happened to be reading a book by Uri Geller at the time. I was in that kind of reading. So I thought, well, Urantia, that kind of maybe goes together. So back then I began kind of an early age 20 or so, in studies of the Urantia Book, alongside many other things, including extraterrestrial phenomena and anomalous phenomena, psychic studies, consciousness studies. So I've always been in that, but I wanted to maintain a kind of a foot in mainstream academia. I had a tough time doing it, but I've tried a lot and studied at various places and never got admitted to PhD programs. And particularly because I was sort of audacious in that I wanted to actually write a dissertation on the Urantia Book, which no one had ever done. And that was a long time ago. And they kind of showed me the door. It was University of California at Santa Cruz. And they said, well, you're kind of more theological. You should go to the theological seminary at Berkeley. So they helped me get into Berkeley. And I kind of got shown out of that place, too, after a short time. And because I was kind of ahead of my time, I guess you would say. That was the early 1980s. And so I became a journalist, actually, covering things in Silicon Valley. And that was kind of my career, my straight career for a long time. And at the end of that career, almost about a decade, I started a software company that was based partially in Silicon Valley, partially in another location. So I ended up having this company, even though I'm a intellectual type, and I was running a software company which was highly successful. And with those funds, I started Origin Press, and Origin Press started publishing these kind of offbeat things that I was interested in. So I became really the first person to do sort of professional publishing of books about the Urantia Book. No one had really done that. There had been minor attempts. And so I kind of took the lead in that, and also published, as you mentioned, the books of Phillip Krapf, who was now kind of forgotten, but a very important abductee of that period, late 90s, when he first got to be well known. So I became his publisher as well. And because of him, I sort of met everybody in the UFO field back then and got to know a lot of the key people, or met them back then, because we were introducing Phil, who was, a distinguished figure because he had won a Pulitzer Prize at LA Times as an editor there. And so he was, people took note of this guy. So I kind of traveled with him and introduced him to people like John Mack and Richard Dolan and others that were interested in his story. It's one of many stories, but it's a pretty unusual account. And so Phil had a tough career because we can maybe get to it later. But we did 3 books. And from that, I just became very interested in this. And anyway, I kind of migrated back to academia more recently. I more or less retired and got a degree in theology. And that's because of the influence of the Urantia Book, which is a kind of theological text. And so I've been trying to do a kind of comparison of the Urantia text to any current knowledge, in particular Christian theology and Christian thought, mainly, not just Christian, but especially that. And so my newest book is directed at sort of that audience. My last 2 books. And there's a lot to talk about in those 2 worlds. So
well, let's begin with Phillip Krapf and his information about the Verdants. So why don't you tell us about that abduction experience and his books? Because, as you said, he was a very serious witness, a former Pulitzer Prize-winning editor for the Los Angeles Times, wrote these books, and you got to publish them. So, yeah, tell us about who these Verdants were, how, and what was the information they shared with him.
The way this happened is the first book by Philip was published by Hay House, and Louise Hay chose that book against the advice of her staff, and she just loved him because there was just nothing like it. So that book became a bestseller, and I acquired the rights to that book. And then because I had gotten to know Phil and his story, and he had a second book, and the second book is, quite amazing. The first book is also stunning because he was a very, very straight and as mainstream as you can possibly get. LA Times, the 80s and 90s was totally straightforward mainstream stuff. And he was an editor, and mainly a copy editor there. So it wasn't like the top of the place, but he was, very, very senior there. And, he retired and he got abducted at a certain point after his retirement out of his bedroom, and his wife had to be away for the weekend, and Phil had the most shocking, experience of his life, being a very suburban, straight guy, an atheist, not interested in anything, psychic or anything like that. So I think they had a particular agenda, which was that these Verdants, as they're called, Verdants, Verdants, said that they wanted to create a liaison, a diplomatic liaison, through Phil and others with Earth. So this is different in that they had chosen someone at the LA Times, actually his boss, as the conduit for a huge PR program, PR outreach by these ETs to the world, saying, we're here and we want to have this diplomatic relationship so that we can bring enlightenment to your planet. And the last big part of this is that they stated to Phil that they had brought up to their ship, their mothership, nearly 1,000 other distinguished human beings from all races, classes, language groups had been brought up on board and briefed on this plan. And this had started in 1997. And so by the time Phil was on the ship, they basically said, we've designated you, or asking you to be kind of the scribe for the story, since you're a very highly experienced, editor of news. And this is going to be news. This is going to be the greatest news in the history of the planet. So would you like to do it? And he, kind of reluctantly said yes, because he was, really charmed by them, but also, amazed by what their story was and their history, and thought they had a benign agenda. So he put out this book through Hay House. It was widely read, 1998, 99. And then his troubles began from that point on. So that's the beginning of the story. That's a start, and maybe you can direct me to what aspect you want to know.
Right. Yeah, I remember reading those books, and I was fascinated by it. And I was particularly interested in the fact that this was a kind of diplomatic initiative that, as you said, that they had taken up 1,000 individuals from around the world, and that they were coordinating all these individuals, some of them very senior officials, to reveal the existence of extraterrestrials. And this was all happening around that period. And things happened. I mean, there were kind of major global events that happened that delayed it. And I think one of the big ones was the 9/11 attack in 2001. That not only did that derail the Disclosure Project initiative by Stephen Greer, but apparently that also derailed this initiative by the Verdants that were working with Phil Krapf and 1,000 other high-level officials to reveal the truth about extraterrestrials. So, yes, I mean, what do you think about that? Is that something that really did happen, that this 9/11 attack really did derail this potential disclosure initiative?
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, it has to be the case because we had this big rollout for the second book, which was announcing this. And it was quite an enterprise because, I brought in a high-level PR firm, and we got him speaking as the keynote speaker at a major UFO conference on the West Coast in San Jose at the time. It was September 16th, 2001 was the date of his keynote, and we were going to have the press there. So back then, the press, you could get the press to cover somebody like Phil Krapf because he was one of them. And he had a Pulitzer Prize. So we had a pretty good story to tell. So we sent this out and got interest from the press. And so everybody was terribly excited. And I printed a lot of these books. And Phil was excited because he was going to announce this thing. And what was supposed to happen is that soon thereafter, the disclosure of the contacts with these 1,000 humans would occur, in that they would go public. Right, so they would go public. It would be the most enormous sort of disclosure, you could imagine, because you'd have the Stephen Greer event. That was May of that year. In fact, I was Stephen's publisher at that point, but he fired me way through it. But that's another story. But that was a disclosure. But this is going to be a massive disclosure by all these people that supposedly were waiting in the wings, and they would then come out, and then the Verdants would announce themselves along with that. And Phil would be the spokesperson, but Phil would be more the writer, and the main spokesperson would be the senior person at LA Times, whose name was never disclosed. So all this is getting ready to go when 9/11 happened, 5 days ahead of that. So Phil states that what we did is we withdrew that book, and we had to revise the book to state that the contact was called off on the night of 9/11 because they beamed up Phil Krapf and to tell him, your planet is too dangerous for us to do this. We knew it was a dangerous place, but we didn't know that it had the capacity to do atrocities of this kind, especially the United States. So we're like out of here. We are not going to do this, and we're calling off the contact. So this was a shock for everybody involved, of course, and especially for Phil. So we did still have his presentation. So, it was September 16th, so people couldn't even get there because of 9/11, because a lot of people were flying to San Jose, and many coming to see Phil. And people couldn't even get on flights. So only local people came, and the press didn't really come. So Phil gave the talk, but it was very, terribly dramatic and disappointing, for us. So after that, Phil became, a depressed person because his story, his corroboration is now, disappeared, dried up. So there's much more that comes after that.
There seems to be a pattern in terms of contact initiatives. I know, for example, there was Robert Emenegger in the 1970s that he was going to be putting out this film where they were going to be releasing some evidence that he had been given by the Air Force in a documentary, but the Air Force kind of backed out at the last minute. I think it was around 1989, 1990, as the Cold War was ending. Apparently, the Secretary General of the United Nations was also involved in a disclosure initiative, and apparently that was aborted at the 11th hour because of some abductions that involved the Secretary General and threats against other world leaders if they went forward with this. And of course, then you have the Phil Krapf story. So it seems that whenever we get close to some kind of major global event with contact, whether you call it the deep state, the Illuminati, the cabal, that these people are able to do something to sabotage or derail that effort. And then all of a sudden it's kind of like all gone. So, I mean, that's been a pattern that I've observed that's happened again and again.
Michael, it's really good to hear that from a scholar like yourself. That is an interesting correlation. I would throw in there another one that you well know is earlier on, Forrestal was going to do some kind of disclosure, and he was probably assassinated. So this is the pattern, and we all speculated that it was the deep state or something like that. Well, I mean, not only that 9/11 was some kind of an inside job, and it had multiple purposes. One of them was to stop the disclosure. That seems for sure. And the disclosure might have brought peace to the planet, but instead we had the war on terror. We had a calamity after calamity. The invasion of Iraq and all these things that could not have happened if the Verdants had been successful, for example. So the tragedy of this is deep, and the story needs to be revived. I would say the full story. There's got a last part of the story which is very poignant, because I was Phil's publisher and editor, and his wife wouldn't take a phone call. She wouldn't let him pick up the phone from me, because the family had turned against this whole thing, because the family didn't really quite get it, and they were very straight like him, right? But they had no experience with this, and they stopped contact with me as the publisher. And I said, I get it, I understand, I'm going to leave you guys alone. And so I didn't do anything for a while until Phil called me out of the blue and said, I've been very depressed, but they're back in contact with me. So a new contact started with Phil, but it was only for his personal needs. And so the third book is about the new contact, which basically was a gift to him by the Verdants, in which they sent a kind of a therapist to him. This is the most bizarre story, but it's actually I think one of the better books I've ever published, because he's an atheist. Okay, number one. Number two, he's mainstream guy. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He's an honest, and the guy's honesty was unimpeachable. People just believed him, even without the evidence. And now here he is, his life really destroyed. His friends at the LA Times thought he was nuts. His wife is, having doubts. His daughter doesn't want to hear about any of it. So Phil states that they beamed down this being, this person, who was not a Verdant, but worked with the Verdants, some other kind of extraterrestrial, who became his therapist. Really, he was depressed. He was very depressed. So this being gave him teachings, and so this book is called Conversations with Paul. Is like a self-help book, and he recorded these things, by memory, and wrote these lessons out. So anyway, this was how the story ends. And Phil ends with, he kind of got on even, back on even keel. After that, he was okay with it, and kind of a senior person in the UFO field, who had a lot of credibility with a lot of people, but did not. The punchline was withheld, and his story began to become obscure. So I want to thank you, Michael, for reviving it.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting, because as you mentioned, he's a very credible person. I mean, Los Angeles Times Pulitzer Prize winner, and he's telling about this incredible experience with these alien Verdants and engaged in a diplomatic mission to promote global peace
Yes.
and disclosure. And all of a sudden, things happen that derail all of that. And I guess the problem is always comes down to even if you get the most credible people, that the evidence, the hard evidence, is often lacking because there are agencies in place to either withdraw or remove that evidence or to intimidate witnesses. I mean, if there were 1,000 other individuals ready to come forward that were very high level, none of them came forward because I assumed that they were all very frightened about the consequences of doing so in a hostile media environment.
There were a lot of side stories that Phil told us. Were not in the books. For example, he states that there were contactees in, of all places, Afghanistan, and it was called the Northern Contingent. The Taliban had a kind of a spin-off group that was much more enlightened and much more liberal, and they were in the north part of Afghanistan. And he believed that they were contactees, that their two leaders were contactees. He was told that by them. And those two men got assassinated soon after 9/11. And there's a whole story of how that happened. It was a grisly story. So he said that was like a message to all the other contactees. Plus now the war on terror, and it was a time of terror, and people didn't want to come out. But I and others tried to get Phil to disclose more about these people, but he was a man of integrity, and he was not going to do that to save his reputation. He said, "I'm not going to play God with these people's lives and disclose them as having been, abducted without their permission." And there was one guy that he said was based in Washington, D.C., that was possibly going to go public, and this guy had been invited, kind of as consolation, to go on a trip to a distant place, actually to the Verdant planet, which was a faraway galaxy, and was returned after 4 years. And the guy considered going public, but he didn't. So this was hard for me and everybody. Phil, why don't you give us something? And soon thereafter he passed away. Phil died of cancer in 2007.
That's a very sad case, and it kind of reminds me of someone of kind of similar stature in Mexico City who had contact with an extraterrestrial. He was a professor of nuclear medicine at the University of Mexico. And he faced a lot of skepticism, and he was actually institutionalized at one point. His wife had arranged for him to be institutionalized in a psychiatric ward because it was deemed to be so ridiculous that he's having extraterrestrial contact. But he was a professor of nuclear medicine teaching at the University of Mexico. He's openly saying, I'm having these contacts with these extraterrestrials from the Andromeda star system, and the skepticism was ruthless, and they committed him, and he disappeared from the scene soon after he was released from that institution.
So makes you think of John Mack, right? They tried to kick him out of Harvard. I mean, he was a tenured professor of psychiatry, very distinguished, tremendous author, researcher. The story. So they had to bring in Danny Sheehan to defend him against the academic senate of that was trying to throw him out and trying to wreck his life. And of course, we know the story that he won that argument and he was reinstated. But you take a guy like that, and they almost did get rid of him.
Mm-hmm. Well, I went through something similar myself at American University from 2001 to 2004. Just such hostility by senior academics about the evidence that the extraterrestrial phenomenon was real, and it just kind of built up. And then at the end in 2004, when the Washington Post did a feature story on my research into the Eisenhower extraterrestrial contact meetings in 1954, I was summarily dismissed, and my the program that I was trying to set up was just immediately eliminated. So yeah, I mean, if you have any kind of professional life and you get back in that day, I mean, if you got involved in these issues, I mean, it was very hard to kind of survive the skepticism and the backlash from peers and superiors.
Good theme, Michael, for you and me to discuss, because the same things happen with the Urantia book. There's similar stories of people trying to bring it into academia. I'm one of the most vivid stories in my case. I tried it twice, and the first time was, really, as I mentioned, I was really shown the door, and I was a pretty good student there at this place in a PhD program. They had admitted me. They knew about my background, but once I got a proposal for a dissertation, they just couldn't. They just had to rim me any way they could. And so it took me 30 years to get back to academia to do that kind of work. And only when I was, in my late 60s, older than my professors, would people even listen to this stuff. So at Union Theological Seminary, just a few years ago, when I went back there, after my semi-retirement, I found two professors who were willing to let me do one chapter in my thesis on the Urantia book. And that's because, they could see I knew what I was doing in terms of being, a mature person. And even then, they were kind of warning me, go too far with this. And so, I had to do double what a typical student would do, in my scholarship. I just had to, sort of like what African-American people say, we have to be twice as good as white people because we're African-American. And so I knew that. So this thesis, took months and months to write, and then I did get an academic publisher to publish it. So, but it, took my whole life to get to that place. And you get, it colors everything. And so I feel better off than many Urantia folks and pastors who've been thrown out of churches. A lot of that happens with Urantia people. and we, that's the kind of world we live in still today.
So why don't you tell us, walk us through, what is the Urantia book? I mean, we know that it has over 2,000 pages of really dense material that was published in 1955. So, yeah, why is that book so important?
Well, the Urantia book, has sold or been distributed over 1 million copies worldwide. It's in 25 plus languages. It's widely known, but it's mainly underground because it gets people in trouble in their churches or wherever they are. But its influence is broad and vast, and even in music and in arts and in philosophy. You can see it. I can see the air marks of it. I consider the Urantia book to be a kind of a gift of compensation, a compensatory gift to planet Earth that is in line with what we know about revelation. The concept of revelation, as I understand it, is that revelation, such as the Bible, such as the advent of Christ, for example, is at a time of great crisis. And so if you think of it this way, that in a theological sense, that you have a deity who loves you and who's your creator, at least in the sort of the Christian or Abrahamic view, or the Islamic view, or even the Hindu view. So this deity is trying to share herself. So the different ways that deity can do that. And so the Urantia book, in my view, is a compassionate deity saying, look, you have these ancient scriptures. They're pretty good, but they're ancient. They're pre-scientific. So I'm going to give you a modern scripture. That's how I see it. It's a postmodern or modern scripture, which sounds oxymoronic. How could you have scripture in the modern time? But that's basically how we see it. And so it's not just any text, but it's also not inerrant, the way fundamentalists think the Bible is inerrant. Same time, we think it's revelatory, and thousands of people around the world believe that. People think that it's dense. I don't think it's dense all the way through. There are parts that are quite readable, and particularly part 4 of the Urantia book is highly readable. It's a representation of the New Testament stories of the life of Jesus. Most people probably know that the Urantia book, part 4, is over 700-page restatement of the teachings of the life of Jesus, and it's a plausible story written in a way that's modern. It's not a metaphysical text like a theosophical text or like the wanderings of Jesus, in the Far East, visionary tale. It's a straightforward narrative, and it is incredibly inspiring to almost everybody that reads it. I really have never met anybody that was not inspired by part 4 of the Urantia book. Doesn't mean they believe the revelatory claims. But in regard to our discussion of, off-planet beings and extraterrestrials, I think of the Urantia book as one of the best sources in the world of knowledge about extraterrestrial and ultra-terrestrial life. I say that because the taxonomy of types of beings is, I think, unparalleled in world literature. And if you go, for example, more into the field of angels, and angelology, the study of angels, there's just nothing close to the Urantia book's description of the angelic worlds that I've ever found. I mean, including Rudolf Steiner or, Blavatsky or any esoteric text. There's nothing like it. And its description of extraterrestrial worlds is also revelatory. We can get into that if you like. But I think to round that out, there's since I have a kind of some expertise now in theology, that the theology of the Urantia book is what we need for today, because it gives assurances and a kind of consolation that modern people can understand. It subtracts from the equation the archaic ideas of the Bible, but upgrades the better aspects of the Christian teaching, of the Abrahamic teaching, and brings it up to the modern scientific age. So that's kind of a general introduction.
So can you tell us about this contact commission of 6 individuals led by this Dr. William Sadler, a psychiatrist, that was involved in the compilation and authorship of the Urantia book? Because, I mean, if it is kind of revelatory texts similar to the Old Testament, the New Testament, that are ascribed to different authors of distinction or sources, I mean, who are these individuals that are doing that for the Urantia book?
Yeah, it's a complicated story, but I'll boil it down to a few elements. Again, it has to do with timing, something like this. So at a time of great crisis, which is post-World War I, and you're moving toward World War II. And so in that period of time, the Western civilization, really world civilization, was at great crisis. And so the contacts began just after World War I. And these are contacts in Chicago with this guy you mentioned, Sadler, who's a psychiatrist and a physician, and who also taught at University of Chicago, one of the divinity schools there. He was a candidate because he was a visionary thinker, but very, very grounded scientific person, because he was a physician and a psychiatrist. And he actually studied with Freud for a time and knew the inner circle, Freud's inner circle. He was a man of his time and was an innovator in psychiatry, but basically a mainstream psychiatrist. In those days, people could be both physicians and psychiatrists. So he had both. He was both MD and a PhD, psychiatrist and medical doctor. So he was the initial contactee. I should say he was the person who, take that back, he was the person who validated the initial contactee, because the contactee was brought to him a little bit in the same way that people came to John Mack, a psychiatrist at Harvard, and said, we have these weird stories of abduction and can you figure this out? How could this be? This must, but we have so many stories. Like, well, with Sadler, there was one story that nobody could crack, but he had made a hobby of looking at cases of contact. He did it as a hobby, as a psychiatrist, because, as you may know, Michael, in that period of time, there was a lot of people channeling stuff. It's like a Victorian obsession with the other world. right? And, there are high points of that, like Blavatsky's work, but it was all over the place in England. Psychic phenomena were occurring, and there were these contactees. And so Sadler actually went around debunking channels. That's probably why they chose it, because they brought him a case that he couldn't debunk. So this case was brought to him, and it happened that the person lived near him. And it was like a Edgar Cayce kind of thing, where somebody in deep sleep has these beings speaking through them. And Sadler thought he could make short work of this, because he had seen people doing this kind of thing. And he did all these tests to see if this guy was sane, whether this guy was hoaxing, and many things like that he couldn't prove this one. And he kept trying to prove it for years that it was a hoax, because he was just that kind of person. He was really from the positivist movement of the early part of the century. He was more like that. He was not even like Freud. Freud was more speculative, but Sadler was, a really empirical scientist and psychiatrist, looking, because he was also a physician. So you figured this guy had some kind of organic problem. After a time, he began to notice that the messages that this guy was giving in these sessions, these night sessions, were really very coherent. And they went on for weeks and then months. And him and his wife would, 3 or 4 nights a week. And by the way, his wife was also an MD physician. So his wife got involved, and they were listening to this stuff. And the wife of this guy, was very concerned, like, is my husband going crazy? So it went on for several years, and the contacts became, or the statements made by the sleeping subject, as they called it, became very compelling and coherent. So at some point, some years into this, after he'd been kind of educated by this being, by the being speaking through, and there were multiple beings speaking through him. They said, we think you should make up a bunch of questions, and we're going to answer them. And we want them to be advanced questions. So he made up and compiled over 500 questions. And he never brought the questions to them. But one day he found the questions answered in writing. They were near the bed of the contactee, but it was hundreds of pages in handwriting, not of the contactee's handwriting. They actually brought in handwriting analysts, 3 of them. It was not his handwriting. The answers had been written. He hadn't stated the answer, but the answers were there. So this got his attention, right? And his wife's attention. So then the beings, there a lot of things happened, but basically the next thing they said is, look, we have something very important to tell you, and we think that you are the right folks to become our contactee for a major revelation. We'd like you to bring in a few others who will be the contact commission. So the contact commission became basically the close relatives of this couple, the Sadler, Lena, the wife, and Bill Sadler. And so the contact commission was assembled around this person. But at a certain point, the contact was auditory in the room. They couldn't see who it was, but they just heard it. So it wasn't spoken through the channel, through the sleeping man. So then they said, look, we're going to begin this process. And by this time, almost 10 years had passed. So in February of 1924, these chapters began to materialize. And there is no evidence that the contact person channeled it or wrote it. And the reason we know that is because there were copyright lawsuits much later in the 90s. And the copyright lawsuits, put in more or less public domain whether there was an author. And so there was the one side wanted to retain the copyright. The other side said you can't have a copyright because you can't demonstrate an author. And they never did. They were never able to show any proof of any kind of any chain of custody of this going back to the channel. And there was several phases of litigation. Millions of dollars were spent. And finally, the Fifth Court of Appeals, basically adjudicated and said there's no author here. So this is in the public domain. That was around 2003, roughly. So then the Urantia book became much more popular because anybody could publish it. But the original publisher wanted to hold on to the copyright just to protect the text. So I was sympathetic with both sides. So anyway, the Contact Commission had one more task, I should tell you, which is they were to receive these chapters, read them, and ask questions. But right away, early on, the higher beings said, we want you to bring in others to read it, to read these drafts. These are handwritten drafts. Some of them literally materialized in a safe. In the beginning, they were showing up near the bed of the contact person. So this was really quite a phenomenon. And what the higher being said was, we now want input from ordinary people. We want you to invite people who are your patients, your medical patients, and your psychiatric patients, just ordinary people, ordinary suffering human beings who want to know what the questions would be. We want them to read the papers and give questions. So they went many years, over 15 years of going back and forth. They would read this material that they would check out in the kind of the library at the medical office, at the home of the Sadlers. They would have to come in and read it during the week. Then they had to write down questions, and the questions were fed to the higher beings. And the higher beings would do new drafts of these chapters or papers in response to the questions. So there's an interactive, co-creative aspect of the Urantia book that's remarkable. So it's not just sort of like Blavatsky downloading something and putting it in a book. It's an interaction over many years of many beings with higher beings with many human beings. So that's on that basis, they tried to get a copyright saying, well, they had human input into this. So there's a kind of a human element, but the court said that's not real copyright. But it really was demonstrated that there was for sure, some kind of human element in this. And that's an important part of the story. So that's a little bit on the Contact Commission.
It's fascinating. And again, I see patterns repeating themselves here. I mean, this seems to be similar to you mentioned Uri Geller before. He was working with Andrija Puharich, also a psychiatrist, and he was very much interested in this group called the Nine, and he eventually worked with a number of channels, including Uri Geller, and eventually ended up with Phyllis Schlemmer, who was channeling the Nine, and so she became known for those channelings, and that was part of the Only Planet of Choice. And then you have another example of that with Professor Don Elkins, who was the kind of intermediary for Carla Ruckert, and they came up with the law of one information. So again, you have like a hard-nosed scientist, a skeptic, rigorous positivist, into kind of like setting up technologies to make sure that they weren't being fooled. So you had that with Andrija Puharich, you had that with Don Elkins and Carla Ruckert, and it seems that this Dr. William Sadler played the same role with that initial unknown channeler, and the group assembled around him were just really making sure that this was authentic, that there wasn't any kind of like fakery happening here. That and that seems to be a pattern that I think is something we can observe with these kinds of texts that stand the test of time, because the Only Planet of Choice, the Law of One material, and of course the Urantia book, they decade after decade continue to be cited, continue to be supported by many people.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's very important that to make the credibility of this is obviously a huge issue because there's a lot at stake, Michael. You got a very troubled planet, and we really are not solving our problems, and we really do need help. We need off-planet help. So we know from our field that extraterrestrials and angelics are reaching out, but often it has to be through humans, and the human factor is what really ruins much of these messages because really contaminates it with the mentality of the channel. So if you can rule out the noise, maybe there's a signal there, and much of the channeling falls by the wayside. You got other examples. I mean, the Course in Miracles, of course, is an exemplary text because it comes through kind of a very rigorous academic psychologist at Columbia University, and Helen Schuckman, and her her partner in that was a very skeptical psychologist himself and a PhD himself. So that gave a lot of credibility to the Course in Miracles. But I do think that Urantia Book is in a class by itself because not so much the technique of its revelation, but the text itself is, I think, superior in its literary and intellectual quality and its coherence. It can that's what I was able to demonstrate in my recent master's thesis, that you can put alongside it the greatest theologians and read the two together comparatively. You can read Alfred North Whitehead alongside the Urantia Book, and it holds up, and they sort of correlate with one another. You can read it next with Teilhard de Chardin, or even philosophers like Kant and Hegel. It holds up in comparison, and that's what I do in that text. And it's pretty hard to make the usual channeled text hold up against the greatest philosophers in the West or even the East. And so I think that if people would give it some time, they would see that this has the excellence that we rarely get in these channeled texts.
Well, one of the fascinating things about the Urantia Book is the information that it has about extraterrestrial inhabited worlds. And one of the papers or one of the chapters is just titled "The Inhabited Worlds." So you want to tell us what's in that particular chapter?
Yeah. Thanks for that question, Michael. This is a characteristic of the Urantia Book. Some of the chapters read like a textbook. There's just nothing sensationalistic about it. It's a matter of fact and very coherent and sort of rational, right? So this is a rational depiction of the worlds that are inhabited throughout the entire universe. So when we say the entire universe, the Urantia Book has like a two-part universe. And I want to give a little bit of background, if I may, Michael, so people can understand context. That the Urantia Book says there's a central universe, which is the mother of all universes. It's the source of universes. And the central universe is eternal. It's an eternal domain, and it has worlds that are inhabited there. Then the evolutionary universe is the other part of the universe. So there's the eternal mother universe, central universe, and then the evolving universes. So that's all of the galaxies that we see. So the evolving universe is evolutionary and is experiential, I should say, and experimental. Whereas the central universe is perfect, and there are beings that live there that are eternal beings that are perfect. So this is a very interesting combination of elements. So the evolutionary worlds are populated by humanoid beings of 7 kinds. And the variations of the kinds of beings that are there, as told in that chapter, I'm trying to give you a few of the 7 because it's a lot to it. But basically, planets break down, especially by their atmosphere. And so this goes into some detail about the kinds of atmospheres that you find out there. And there's all kinds of atmospheres depending on distance from the sun, size of the planet, the mineral composition of the planet, and many other factors. about 70% of planets that are inhabited are planets that have suitable atmospheres like our atmosphere, meaning there's enough oxygen, and that respiration is, critical part of, energy intake. But there's 30% are other kinds of atmospheres, including the atmosphere that you see on Venus and the atmosphere you see on Mars. So the atmosphere on Venus is an atmosphere that is, their term for this is, it's a super atmosphere, meaning you can't breathe it, so you have to. There's what they call them super breathers. There's a respiration on a place like Venus. Mars is what they call subatmospheric, where there's really hardly any atmosphere with the moon. But you could still have what they call subbreathers. And this is, so the percentage of these is something like 7% or something like Venus, and a small percentage or something like Mars. And there's other types. And then there are planets that have no atmosphere at all. And those planets can be inhabited as well. And those are planets that are called non-breathing planets. So those are the types of atmospheres on planets. And we're talking about billions of inhabited planets. The Urantia Book, remember, it comes through in the 1930s. It comes through this group of 400 people in the 1930s who are ordinary people. It's just totally blowing their minds, right? So they're learning that there are millions, billions of inhabited worlds. And back then they didn't exactly know that there were galaxies, right? Not until Hubble did anybody identify galaxies as such. Hubble is, the late 20s. So they're now being told that there are thousands of inhabited galaxies. And actually, the Urantia Book is the first text in the world of its kind that talks about millions of galaxies that are out there. There was no knowledge of that at the time the text was coming through. So the Inhabited Worlds chapters is one of 196 chapters in the Urantia Book. And it says that, there's other ways, that other kinds of planets having to do with size of planet. So if you have a huge planet, what happens? You have to be short to be on a huge planet because of the gravity of the planet. But if it's a smaller planet, then you're going to tend to be taller. So in the smaller planets, you can get up to 10 feet tall. So we see ETs that are 10 feet tall because the planet's small. That's to do with the gravity. But on big planets, you can be as low as 3 feet tall. And that's just what we see in the extraterrestrial record, that they're, short and tall and in between. But the average size of a planet of the height is about 7 feet in our local set of planets. I should add finally that the universe is broken up into local units of planets called systems of 1,000 planets that are inhabited, and then larger units until you get to 10 million inhabited planets in a local, big area, local universe. But then it gets even bigger when you get, hundreds of millions of planets in a galaxy, and then even bigger when you get a trillion planets, say, in a galaxy cluster. And the Urantia Book says that there are 7 great galaxy clusters that are inhabited, about 1 trillion each. So that's 7 trillion inhabited superclusters. So I'll add to that a footnote, which is important, which is that most galaxies are not inhabited according to the Urantia. They are not inhabited galaxies. There's a central realm of galaxies that are clustered around the central universe, and those galaxies are inhabited. But when you go further out, the galaxies in more distant space are not yet inhabited. There's a whole story about those galaxies.
That was one of the things that kind of like both impressed me and also awed me when I had a look at the Urantia Book kind of soon after I got interested in the exopolitics field in the early 2000s. I just gave it a very cursory look. And as you say, it described all these galaxies that make up these separate universes that are populated by different extraterrestrial civilizations, and then you got this central galaxy or the central universe that's made up with these eternal beings. And it was fascinating. I looked at that and I thought, well, how do I possibly confirm this? And you mentioned the Hubble telescope that came out in the 90s,
Yeah.
and it began to, I guess, confirm all these galaxies out there. And more recently, they've been confirming all these superclusters like the Laniakea supercluster and the Virgo supercluster, that these are actually galactic entities out there that can be separated from other things. So to me, that was like, okay, so the astronomy has developed with the, as you mentioned, the Hubble telescope, and more recently with the Webb telescope, and they're identifying these superclusters out there where, you know, these are kind of distinct from one another. So to me, that is kind of evidence saying that, well, this Urantia book that dates all the way back to the 1930s actually corroborates with modern astronomical observations.
It really seems to do that. And it also correlates with other science since then. For example, you probably know the case of the Urantia Book is the first text of its kind that said that there was tectonic plates on the planet and what they call continental drift. And that theory was not accepted at the time that the Urantia Book came through. And they describe in some detail this notion of tectonic shifting and drift of, you know, so from the Pangea, the original continent, and then the drifting apart of Latin America and Africa and the rest. And they said that was the case in the 1920s and 30s, and that was long before it was demonstrated, not really until the 1960s, that they then got the proof when they did underwater, you know, scientific exploration at the point of the, you know, where the plates come together, you know, in the Atlantic Ocean, for example, where they first noticed that there was this movement of the plates. And so the Urantia Book is considered to be, you know, kind of amazing because it did predict that. And there's a famous geophysicist who wrote a book that said, I don't know who these people are. I don't know, but this is my field. And I had a student that brought this to me, and he says this book came out, was finished by 1940. It's impossible because we didn't know there was continental drift at that time. It was hypothesized by a few fringe scientists, you know. So this is one example, but there's many other examples that would take us maybe far afield into the science of the Urantia Book, in particular the archaeology of the Urantia Book. We might want to get into that we have verified some of its claims that are important, you know, for the discussion of prehistory.
Well, you know, that takes us to this, excuse me, that takes me to the Lucifer rebellion. And so here you have a universe with all these galactic superclusters, and there's this being Lucifer who, I guess, defects from the central universe or the central supercluster and leads a rebellion in our supercluster. So you want to walk us through, you know, what was all that about?
Well, I ask for people's patience as I get to kind of sketch this out. And yes, it's a cosmology that I hope folks know. They don't have to agree with it, but you should, know what the Urantia Book claims, because, you know, you're going to be hearing a lot about this in future years. That the Urantia Book states, as I said, that the central universe is eternal. The external, outside of this singularity in the center, which is outside of space-time, is the space-time universe. So the space-time universe has layers. So the Lucifer rebellion does not come from the supercluster level or the galactic level, or even sort of the lesser sectors. It comes from the local system. So again, the Urantia Book has this incredible breakdown where you have superclusters with, billions of planets. Then you've got sectors called the local universe, which are 10 million inhabited. Then the subset of that is a local system. It's 1,000 inhabited planets. So the local system here that we're in has the angelic host of the system. So That's the Christian term. It's not the term they use. But the angels and the super angels in the Urantia book are very important, that because the universe is populated by angelic beings in higher dimensions, not physical, of course, that are ministering to the humans. And the humans need ministers in order for them to ascend and for them to evolve. Why do they need that? Because it's a co-creative universe. It's not just humans coming out of the dust. It's also deity reaching down to us to give us a hand, so to speak, in this co-creation of the evolution of higher consciousness. So the angels have a very important role because they're, in one sense, they're administrators, but on the other sense, they're ministers, especially. So the ministering angels are ministering to planets in different staffs, certain different cores, you might call it. And each planet has a large number of angels, really seraphim in particular, who are assigned to minister to individual humans. But there's other kinds of angels that do other things on a planet. There are angels on a planet, on every planet, that foster industry. They foster science. They foster invention. They foster music. They foster humor. They bring about government. For example, the idea of tripartite government is sourced from higher realms, according to the Urantia book. And these are angelically inspired in the minds of humans. So they minister us in all kinds of ways, not just sort of like making us feel good when we're suffering or giving us good ideas for our life, but also culture, government, arts. So anyway, there's administrator angels that kind of oversee these staffs of angels on these planets. And you've got, hundreds of local planets in our local system as it's called. And the chief angel of the local system was named Lucifer. So the local system of 1,000 planets, actually, our local system has a little over 600 so far inhabited planets. So Lucifer, their chief angel, who was a very high being, millions of angels under his supervision on this higher world where he is based, right? These are higher worlds. They're invisible, where the angelic administration is placed. So this higher world is really the kind of the capital of that world, is where Lucifer resided. And he did something that rarely ever happens. It's a 1 in a million, where he began to believe that his ideas were superior to the ideas of much higher beings. This is something possible because angels have free will. But it's very, very unlikely to happen. So this explains what I hope people can take away from this. This explains why there's so much chaos and misery on our planet, because our chief angel of our local group went to the dark side, so to speak, actually became someone who denied the existence of God and had a kind of a new thesis, a new gospel. It was a gospel that reminds me a little bit of communism, that you should accelerate evolution and run roughshod really over biological and cultural evolution and force humans to progress quickly. This was his view. And his view was that it's kind of every man for himself. And there really is that we are self-existing. We're not really created. And there is no deity that creates us. This is quite a blasphemous thing for an angel to do. There's much more to it, but what happened because of this is that the lesser angels that were under the administration of Lucifer, many of them were very impressed by these arguments that were extremely eloquent from a brilliant higher being. So those angels followed him. And the planets that became sort of taken over by the Lucifer rebellion are not just ours, but 36 other planets out of over 600. So they're a small 5% group of these planets became rebel planets. We are a rebel planet, And a rebel planet is a planet where the angels on the planet have gone to the dark side. Sounds pretty scary. And in fact, that is what we're told happened. However, not all the angels went dark. There was a minority that stayed with the divine agenda, with the divine plan. So the Lucifer Rebellion emanates from this local system, 5% of the planets, and some of those planets are much like our planet. The Urantia book narrates this story and tells you about another planet that had a rebellion as part of the Lucifer Rebellion. It's a very interesting chapter. But anyway, the Lucifer Rebellion is the reason why our planet is on the brink of self-destruction.
These angels, I mean, those that rebelled under Lucifer and those that resisted and followed the higher angels in this central universe, are we talking about higher density beings, like incorporeal, spiritual entities? Or are we talking about flesh and blood extraterrestrials that drive around or fly around in spacecraft?
So this is a great question at this juncture, Michael, because the Urantia book is kind of all the above. It has extraterrestrials, it has ultra-terrestrials, it has these super angels, it has these lower angels, levels of angels, but it also has life on all these other worlds. And some of them are millions of years ahead of us, many millions ahead of us. So it's utterly plausible to a Urantia book reader that there would be extraterrestrials visiting here. But in answer to your question, there is yet another type of being, which are higher angelic type beings that are invisible, non-physical, that can incarnate here. So, that's an area of discussion that is fairly disordered because there's all these hypotheses about the Nephilim and sort of the whole story of extraterrestrial, ancient aliens that came here. So what I would submit is that the ancient alien notion and narrative, that there is a very important contribution of the Urantia book to this discussion, because we have a much more, I'd say, orderly discussion of the taxonomy of these kinds of beings that allows you to make distinctions about who's doing what that we don't easily do right now. So I'll stop there and let you address any of that.
Well, I just wanted to kind of like bring up the fall or the great flood.
Yes.
Where you had, like in the book of Enoch, it describes the fallen angels and how they corrupted humanity, and that led to a war where the righteous angels came in, and that resulted in the great flood, and where things are reset. So, this Lucifer rebellion, how does that relate to the great flood?
So the narration of events in Genesis in the Bible and in other texts such as the Sumerian texts and other apocryphal texts, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, and all the other newer texts that have been found, really come from a pre-modern, archaic domain. There's important texts because we have nothing else really. For example, the Book of Enoch, is very important, and it's contested, in our circles. So what does it really mean? So it talks about roughly the same idea as the Urantia book, that there were these fallen angels that were present as a factor in our history, and this was sort of revealed to Enoch. But that departs a lot from that story because, basically just like this, that the literature of ancient times is not going to be equivalent to a text that comes through in modern times. Number one, an ancient text like this, they're all contested as to what the dates of these texts and the authors of these texts and the translations of these texts. Some of them are compilations, and you can tell that there's different authors of these things. Even with the Book of Enoch, there's different parts of it that don't really match other parts. Certainly with the Bible, and by the time of the 19th century, everybody was deconstructing the Old Testament and the New Testament. They said, these texts are not reliable. I mean, but they've got truth in them and maybe facts in them, but they're no longer to be considered inerrant in any way. So if we derive our story about these things only from the ancient texts, we have a disadvantage, but we have nothing else to go on. But what we Urantia folks say is that we've got an update of these stories in the Urantia text. It's the same stories, but we've got a modern or postmodern rendition of this in a scientific post-Einsteinian quantum theory kind of era. So how would you depict this in the modern era? Well, you need to know the cosmology. You need to know the history that I've narrated a little bit of in order to see where where Enoch fits, for example. One thing I'll cite, for you had a wonderful guest, Timothy Albaneri. Alberino, sorry, who said that Jesus, he insisted that Jesus took the title of the Son of Man from the Book of Enoch. That was an interesting discussion the two of you had. And the Urantia Book affirms that that is the case, that Jesus actually did that. And Timothy should know this. And it makes a very vivid narration that Jesus looked for a title somewhere in Scripture. He could not find one in Scripture, so he went to apocryphal Scripture, the Book of Enoch, and found it there. So he used that. So the Book of Enoch was important to Jesus in this respect. But the Book of Enoch, so-called watchers, what I would like to now do, Michael, depending on the time we've got, is to introduce the pre-Sumerian story that is an alternate story to the Anunnaki, narrative that pervades our field right now, somewhat from the Zecharia Sitchin notion, and show you a new way to think about that. Do you want to try that out?
If we can do that briefly, because I'd like to kind of start bringing it to a close, and I do have a couple more questions I want to ask. So if you can just do a kind of thumbnail sketch of that pre-Sumerian narrative.
So this has to do with the epochal events of our planet, according to the Urantia teaching. Zecharia Sitchin's rendition of this is interesting because it has a similar timeline. The Urantia book says that the most important beginning, of human history is 500,000 years ago, when something like the Sitchin notion happened, which was that extraterrestrial higher beings from another civilization came down to Earth to bring culture to us. And that is the first great epochal revelation to the planet about 500,000 years ago. This was a benign group that came here to bring the first rudiments of culture to the indigenous humans. Sitchin says that the Anunnaki from Nibiru came here around the same time to exploit us, to actually not at first exploit, but to mine gold, right? So then later they realized they needed somebody to do the work for them, so they spliced together genes with female hominids to create the human race, right? And they began to be slaves, and then they had a rebellion. Their rebellion against their lords or overlords occurred around the same time as the Urantia book says there was a rebellion. So we got a parallel there that the Anunnaki are 500,000 years ago, roughly. He says 450,000 years. Urantia book says about 500,000. So rebellion happens 200,000 years ago, according to the Urantia book, and he says I think 250,000 years ago. But it's very different things. There's the same calendar, but a different set of beings do a different set of things, and it's out of that we get the Nephilim legend that comes down in Sumerian and other texts. But the interpretation by the ancient astronauts is quite wide of the mark. Although there are certain aspects of this that match. I would say it boils down to this, and I'll leave you with this. The Sitchin view and those that follow this do not think of us in terms of dignity, that we were created by a benign creator, that we're created in the image of God. They think of us as have been spliced together by extraterrestrials to be slaves. That's two different paradigms. So I think we need comparative work on this and going forward.
It is fascinating. I know there was the revolt of the Igigi in the Sumerian text, so that seems to be what the Urantia book might be referring to. But I wanted to bring it back to this, to Jesus and the Son of Man, kind of like discussion I had with Timothy Alberino and the Book of Enoch. I mean, his view, and I think it's probably consistent with a lot of biblical scholars or those that follow the kind of mainstream religious narrative, is that Jesus was the kind of unique Son of Man that was kind of like extraordinary, stood apart other men. Whereas there are those teachings that say that Jesus went through kind of initiation schools in Egypt and India, Tibet, and so forth, and became like a Son of Man, and kind of laid the path for others to follow him. So some say Jesus is this unique, kind of like no one is like him, Christ-like figure, and the others say that no, Jesus was all about being a wayfarer, to show humans the way to become like him, to become a Son of Man like him. So where does the Urantia book stand on that?
Thank you. Great question. So the great struggle of interpreting who Jesus was continues, to this day. It does bifurcate into kind of two models, like you just outlined. One is a divine being of some kind that's unique in history. The other is an enlightened master like Buddha, who shows the way. Not a divine being, not an incarnate God, that type of stuff from the Christian tradition. Which also you see it in Islam. Islam says that as well. Islam says, there was no resurrection, right? That he was a prophet. He's not, the second person of the Trinity, right? So the reason the Urantia book is not widely accepted in alternative culture circles is that it's actually much more orthodox than people think, because it's an affirmation of the main tenets of patristic Christianity. That is the original Christian view that Jesus is an incarnate deity, hard thing to swallow. And so the so-called Chalcedonian Creed, the agreements that the early church had by the 6th century, is mainly affirmed in the Urantia book, that Jesus was Son of Man. That's a title that he took, but primarily he's Son of God. And of course, the Christians thought he was the second person of the Trinity, which is a huge thing. Incarnate. So the Urantia book qualifies that, but says this is still deity incarnate. So that's why the Urantia book is sort of neither fish nor fowl. It's not alternative, but it's also not Orthodox Christian. It's in the middle. It affirms the key tenets of the Trinity and Jesus as derivative from the central universe. This central universe that I talked about, where eternal beings come from. And the gifting of an incarnation like this is spectacular for a planet, because it's a being from the center of all things, who's a creator deity. Now, we should add a few things about this. The Urantia book depiction of Christ is that there's not just the male Christ, but also a female rendition. And that's the mother spirit, as they call it, along with Christ, who reigns in our local universe as the deities of the local universe of inhabited planets. So remember, I said that this is one of the units of the universe are local universes of 10 million inhabited planets. And there are beings that come from the central universe to become the deities out in space and time. So Christ, known as Christ Michael in the Urantia Book, is one of these deities with his female consort. So our divine parents, according to this, are Christ and the mother. So it's a pair. And they are divine beings. They're paradise origin, that is from the central universe. And so the incarnation of Christ is a momentous event, but it's not a Christian event per se. It's a futuristic, postmodern or post-postmodern notion of Christ. And thank you for giving me the time to state that. That's actually his teaching.
So I just wanted to finish off, give you some final words you'd like to share about your most recent book that came out in May, just a month ago, Reason and Revelation.
So the literature on the Urantia Book is there's not a lot of secondary works, and I've published a number of them, but what I decided to do was something that doesn't happen much in our field, which is to get sort of into the academic realm with this and to find writers whose work is peer-reviewed, academic writers. And typically in our field, we don't have peer review because the academy doesn't accept us. But there are some scholars who've written about the Urantia Book. Very few, because you get kicked out like I did. So this book, Reason and Revelation, can't see it there, but it's just came out, and I edited the best writings by academic types about the Urantia Book and put it in one place so that it's an introduction for anybody, who thinks, highly of academic inquiry. But in this case, we're applying it to the Urantia Book, which is, quite never been done before. So I'm trying to, make an interface between the two, the academic world and the Urantia Book, whereas, much of our work right now doesn't have an academic element. So I'm taking it so far as to bringing this book to the American Academy of Religion. We're going to have a booth there. It's the world's largest meeting of academics in religion, theology, to present this and other related books and my own books to academics and begin to have peer review. So yes, that's my newest book. Thank you, Michael.
So where do people go, Byron, if they want to learn more about your books, learn about the Urantia Book, and or get in touch with you?
Thank you. The best website is by the original publisher. It's urantia.org, and it's a fantastic introductory website for the whole world, and it's in multiple languages of the world. There's urantiabook.org. That's the kind of the fellowship of Urantia Book readers. Then there's my own website. I have a number of them, but I have a new one that's called Rodan Institute, RODAN Institute, rodaninstitute.org. And that's for people that want to do comparative study of the Urantia Book alongside evolutionary knowledge and bring some academic study and also really in a way to celebrate these teachings which are, advanced for our time and build community around that.
Well, thank you, Byron, for sharing fascinating information on the Phillip Krapf material and the Urantia Book.
Thank you, Michael. Been fun talking about it.
You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.